Okay, so I decided after my last review to stick with anime that had to do with games, and no, this does not mean I'm going to be talking about. Instead, I'm going to be talking about an anime that has to do with gambling, as we take a look at the high-stakes adventures of Kaiji. The story of this show has to do with a guy whose name is, well, Kaiji. He's a guy that has no aspirations to do anything except blow all his money on cheap gambles and cigarettes, as well as playing pranks on individuals. However, one day a man approaches Kaiji and tells him that he's inherited a massive amount of debt. Apparently Kaiji was foolish enough to co-sign a loan from a friend, and this friend has disappeared, so now because he's the co-signer, Kaiji has inherited this debt, and this debt is huge. But not all hope is lost, as this man gives Kaiji an offer to take place on a cruise where he will be gambling for big amounts of money. Kaiji sees this as an opportunity. Little does he know that what he's getting into is a high-stakes game that is much more than money at stake. Kaiji then finds himself playing games and getting into gambles involving an underground group of individuals who are greedy, ruthless, and just flat-out evil. This review, of course, takes place with both currently existing seasons of Kaiji, which span the course of 26 episodes each. And throughout the series, it goes through, as I mentioned, a series of games that have to do with different encounters Kaiji has with this group as he accumulates more debt and tries to find a way around these people. Kaiji is essentially the successor to another series called Kaiji, which is also about gambling but has to do with mahjong, whereas Kaiji has to do with a variety of games. Games that aren't necessarily your traditional gambling games. While some may be similar to other ones, there are a lot of variants on them that make them a little more interesting or perhaps more dangerous. The story itself will keep you interested with the sheer twisted individuals who are running the games behind the scenes, as well as Kaiji's unnerving determination to undermine all of it. As I've said, this show's games are more about gambling than anything, and the stakes are really high. On the one hand, you could make several million yen. On the other, you could, lose your fingers, or be forced to work underground, or become the corporate leader's sex slaves. That last one doesn't actually happen, but needless to say, losers are constantly getting fucked. And this continues to remain interesting with the really tense and just unnerving atmosphere this show tends to create. You can feel the stakes that are at hand, and you can feel that people are anxious. Now let's transition to the Kaiji himself. Kaiji is introduced as a character who's kind of a lowlife and kind of an unlikable punk. However, once he's thrown into this world, he has to adapt quickly or he's in serious trouble. And slowly but surely, Kaiji learns how these games work and how exactly it is he needs to survive. He's a survivalist at its purest form, and he becomes brilliant because of it. He realizes that the system is trying to cheat him, so he has to try to cheat the system back. While he is brilliant, he still is never 100% certain on things, so it keeps things interesting to see him try to adapt to these really, really unfavorable situations. As I mentioned, the people who are behind the scenes, the main villains of this series, are just flat out evil sons of bitches. The leader himself is a crazy old dude who has completely lost it and gets thrills off of seeing people suffer. The group themselves thrive off of having their money and poking at those who are desperate for it. It really helps contribute to the overall feel of this series because anybody who knows what gambling can be like, it can be a dangerous thing, and people often get to a state of desperation because of it. I feel like this show conveys that really nicely. When you see people who act foolish and people capitalizing on that, and then there's that one guy who manages to see through everything and it's like, hey guys, that's not cool. The constant wits that Kaiji and these people have going at each other is constantly changing and is really interesting, making each one of the people he encounters require a different strategy and approach in order to cheat them. I won't say too much about the animation itself because it's relatively simple, but what really makes the show is the art style itself. It's very bizarre and everybody looks weird. However, you can definitely tell that some people are a little more corrupt than others, and I think the art style conveys the greed and desperation in different people very nicely. On top of that, the actual art style they use for things when you're actually analyzing how much in despair or how confident somebody is, or just how far a game is progressing, using a various number of metaphors and other things, keeps things really interesting, and it really contributes to the intensity of the show. Now, let's just stop what we're talking about entirely and point our direction to one thing about Kaiji that I absolutely love: the soundtrack. I'm a firm believer that music can easily make or break the intensity or the feeling or ambience of anything. And I feel like Kaiji's music does such a fucking phenomenal job capturing the moment that it's really awesome. The music really sets up when things are getting really clutch or really intense. It sets up nicely when things are coming to a conclusion. It really does help contribute to everything that goes on in the show. I'm an absolute fan of the soundtrack. Now, I seem to be saying a lot of really good things about Kaiji, and for good reasons, because it's a really good show. However, it is not perfect, and there's one major issue this show has that is hard to overlook, and that has to do with pacing. When the show wants to be really intense and pace itself nicely, it does a really good job. However, there are a lot of points in the show that just feel so incredibly slow that it feels like it's more of a grind fest rather than an actual joy. I think the worst contender of this is in the second season, when you have an entire section of the anime based on a game of pachinko. The idea of it's cool at first, but it just gets kind of ridiculous and just does not make any progress for the longest time, and that can be quite a bit of a drag. So the pacing itself can be a bit of a hindrance. However, luckily past that bump, there is a very unique and interesting visual experience that I don't think nearly enough people have seen. It's one of those shows that I would recommend somebody who is an avid anime fan should check out at some point in the time, just because of how interesting it is and unique it is. A lot of animes focus on things like battles and powering up and romance. This one focuses on gambling. And it does a really good job conveying just what it means to truly be in a bit of a struggle, especially when you have something like money on the line, when you're in a state of desperation and you don't know what to do. This is a great seinen series, and I've got to say, with all the good it has and the minor hindrance it has in the pacing department, this show is easily a 9 out of 10.